They brought me into the spire of Calder Vale through the daylight entrance, not the service one, which I understood later was meant as an insult dressed as a courtesy. The light came down through the high lattice of pale stone and long gold columns, and under one of them stood a man in a healer's gray collar who did not offer his name before he started talking. "You are the contracted human," he said. "I am Ket Orvan, healer marshal of this house. You will touch nothing until I permit it." I had been pulled out of a perimeter clinic 4 hours earlier, with no more explanation than urgent and royal, and I had spent most of the transit trying to guess what kind of trauma justified both words. Orvun walked me through it without slowing his pace. The heir, Prince Thomas Vondrai, 5 years old by their reckoning, had a hereditary vascular failure that ran in the bloodline like a fault line in stone. Dranavi physicians treated it with a relay cuff, a wrist-worn stabilizer that took over the work of a failing valve by rerouting pressure through a secondary channel. Thomas's cuff had thrown a fault an hour ago. The backup had thrown the same fault 9 minutes later. They were down to a third unit, freshly synced, currently rebooting. "How long does the reboot take?" I asked. 47 seconds, Orvun said, in the tone of a man reciting a number he already hated. His collapse threshold, unsupported, is 41. I did the subtraction the same way he had, and neither of us said it out loud. I'd worked enough off-world contracts by then to know the shape of a house in crisis before I saw the patient. The corridor into the infirmary was lined with court members standing in postures of formal grief. Hands folded into sleeves, heads bowed at a precise angle I guessed was custom rather than feeling. None of them looked at me. I understood, walking past them, that I'd been summoned not because anyone believed I could help, but because every Dranavi remedy already tried had failed, and someone with authority had decided that failure, with a human present, was politically survivable in a way failure alone was not. It wasn't flattering, it was honest, and honesty I could work with. The infirmary itself was bright in a way I hadn't expected from a palace. Skylights instead of lamps, pale stone instead of shadow, the whole room built like it didn't want anywhere for fear to hide. Thomas was small on the table in the center of it, dark-skinned in the Dranavi way that runs toward violet at the joints, an IV line taped along one thin forearm, the dead relay cuff still strapped to his wrist with its display gone black. Queen Sael Vondre stood at the foot of the table, with both hands pressed flat against it, not touching her son, the way you hold yourself back from a thing you're afraid to disturb. "Healer Marshal," she said. "Why is she still standing there?" "Because I have not decided what she's for," Orvun said. I didn't wait for him to decide. I crossed the room, and nobody stopped me, which told me more about how frightened they were than anything they'd said. The new cuff sat in its charging dock at the head of the table, a slim band of dull alloy with a single circular readout. I picked it up. The display woke under my thumb and began to count down from a fixed reboot interval. That was the protocol. A hard 47 seconds. No shortcuts. The safety margin built in by people smarter than me to keep panicking hands from rushing a fault back into the bloodstream. I watched the numbers, and I watched the boy's chest, which had gone shallow and fast, and I did the only kind of math that's ever mattered to me. Not whose protocol was right, but how many seconds I actually had. "He needs continuous perfusion until that cuff comes online," I said. 47 seconds of mechanical pressure on the vascular line, by hand, timed to his own pulse rhythm so I'm not fighting his heart instead of helping it. I can do that. I need someone counting out loud, and I need nobody to touch him but me until the display reads 0. Orvun's face did something complicated. There's no protocol for manual perfusion in this house. Our hands are not precise enough for vascular work at that scale. Mine have done it 41 times in a clinic with no machines at all, I said. I'm not asking your permission so much as telling you what's about to happen. I think it was the plainness of it that got through to him, more than the claim. He didn't have a counter-argument ready for a thing said without heat. He looked at the Queen looked at her son, and then at me, and nodded once, the kind of nod that costs a person everything they have. I set 2 fingers against the inside of Thomas's wrist, found the thread of his pulse, and began. It's not glamorous work. It's a rhythm, learned in places that don't have backup units or charging docks. Refugee tents, flood triage, the back of a transport with the power out. You press where the vessel narrows, you release on the beat, you do it again, and you do not let your arm shake even when it wants to. I watched the boy's lips, which had started to go the color of old bruises, and I kept my eyes on them, instead of on the readout, because the readout could not tell me anything my own hands couldn't. 40, Orvin said, his voice gone flat and careful, counting the relay's reboot aloud the way I'd asked. 35, 30. Thomas's eyes opened partway at 28, found nothing in the bright ceiling worth focusing on, and closed again. I kept the rhythm. My fingers had gone from ache to something past it, a kind of numb discipline I'd learned to trust more than feeling. 15, Orvin said, and I heard, for the first time, something under the number that wasn't clinical. 10. The boy's pulse stuttered once under my fingers. Not a stop, just a hitch, the body asking a question it didn't have the strength to finish. 5, Orvin said. 3, 2. I didn't stop on 1. I held the rhythm through 0.5 seconds past it, because numbers on a display don't account for the half second of lag between a command and a heartbeat answering it, and that's a thing you only know if you've done this without a machine telling you when to be afraid. The relay cuff chimed. I felt it engage under my palm, a faint mechanical thrum taking over the work my hand had been doing, and only then did I lift my fingers away. The room was silent, except for the boy's breathing, which evened out in front of us, color climbing back into his mouth, and the tips of his fingers like a tide coming in. The readout on the wall display, the one tracking his collapse threshold, had frozen at 6 seconds of unused margin. 6 seconds I hadn't needed and would never get back, the way you never get back the seconds you spend afraid for someone else's child. Orvin was looking at his own hands as if he'd just noticed them. 41 seconds, he said, by hand. We have devices rated for less. Devices fail, I said. Hands have been doing this since before anyone built a device. I just happen to still know how. The Queen came around the table then, and I expected her to go to her son, and she did. But first she put one hand briefly over mine, the way you'd press a hand to confirm something is real, and not a trick of the light. She didn't say thank you. I don't think the Dranavi have a word that small for what had just happened in that room. What she said instead was an offer. A permanent post, court physician to the House of Vondrai, quarters in the spire, a collar of her own gray, to mark me as one of theirs. I looked at Thomas's chest rising and falling on its own, unassisted now, and I looked at Orvin, who had already started writing something into a record pad with the particular urgency of a man revising everything he thought he understood about what counted as medicine. I thought about the clinic at the edge of nowhere that had taught me this rhythm in the first place, the 40 other children I'd counted seconds for, with nothing but my own pulse to measure against theirs. I told the Queen I needed a night before I answered. She didn't ask why, she just nodded, the same costly nod from before, and let me keep my hand where it was a moment longer, against the boy's wrist, feeling for nothing in particular except the plain, steady fact of it still beating. I stayed after they'd gone, filling out a record in the human shorthand I kept for myself. Pulse rate, perfusion duration, the exact count of seconds my hand had carried before the machine took over. 41. I wrote it twice, once for the chart, and once, smaller, in the margin, the way you mark something you mean to remember on purpose rather than by accident. Orvin came back near the end of it, without his record pad this time. We catalog every failure of every device in this house, he said. There has never been an entry for the failure of a hand, because we never trusted a hand enough to test it. I do not know where that entry belongs in our records. Put it wherever you put the things that worked, I said. He didn't answer that, but he didn't argue with it either, which from a man like Orvin, I understood to be its own kind of agreement. I gathered my things in the gold light slanting down through the lattice, the boy asleep now under a thin gray blanket, his new cuff humming its quiet rhythm at his wrist, and I thought that whatever answer I gave the Queen by morning, I had already decided the only number that mattered tonight was the one I'd written twice, the one that meant somebody's hands had been enough.